All right, well, now what we can look at is we can talk about and look at our various types of what we're going to call micronutrients, right? Micronutrients. So these are nutrients that they're required in our body, right? But we need them in much smaller quantities compared, say, to our main macronutrients. So again, think carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. These we're going to need comparatively less, especially when you look at the raw number in terms of what you need per maybe per day, something like that. So if you look at recommended daily intakes, how much of a particular vitamin or mineral or electrolyte or whatever that you need per day, these are going to usually be on the order of things like micrograms. Okay, so really, really small amounts, maybe milligrams. So, our first class is vitamins. Okay, so we've talked about vitamins, we'll talk about minerals later. So, vitamins, these are organic molecules that we're going to use in the body for various types of metabolic processes. Some of them are going to contribute to physical structure, so you need it to make some physical thing inside the body. These are going to help with chemical reactions. Some of them will have to do with forming cells. Some of them are going to have to do with forming clots and absorbing things and allowing you to see. And so there's all these different types, right? And these come in two general categories. These are called fat soluble and water soluble, right? So essentially saying, do they dissolve, or are they dissolvable in water or in adipose tissue or in fat, right? So if we look here, these are our two classes: fat soluble, water soluble. Okay, so if we look first at our fat soluble vitamins, these dissolve in fat, and there's four: vitamins A, D, E, and K. Okay, so for each of these, you're going to find it in different food products. Okay, some come from plant sources, some are found in animal sources, some are found in both. Right, and these, because they're fat soluble, they're actually able to be stored in the fat and potentially stored to the point where they build up and build up potentially into excess amounts, right? So we end up with too much of them. For our water soluble vitamins, as we'll see, that's not necessarily the case because they're not stored in fat. So whenever we urinate, whenever we form urine, we typically pass and eliminate those water soluble vitamins, so B vitamins, C vitamins, right? So if we look at some of these A vitamins, or some of these fat soluble vitamins, first one is A. A, kind of the stereotypical uh, first thing that comes to mind when you think of vitamin A is vision, right? So we need vitamin A to ultimately make something called retinal, and this is necessary to form this protein pigment-like structure in our eye called rhodopsin, right? And so this is a pigment that's allowing us to absorb light in our eye, and we need this vitamin A in order to reform this vitamin A during this phototransduction cascade of events that occurs in the eye whenever light strikes it. Okay, so we can find vitamin A things like our liver can make vitamin A, milk products, veggies, fish oil, eggs, things like that. Vitamin D, this is what forms calcitriol. You may also hear it called calciferol. This is the form of kind of a general term for vitamin D. Calcitriol is kind of the most bioavailable form of vitamin D. And vitamin D's main role is to aid in calcium absorption in our gut. Okay, so you need vitamin D in order to absorb calcium. If you lack vitamin D, if you're vitamin D deficient for whatever reason, you can end up with softer bones, right? And this was something called rickets, and I think we talked about rickets in a previous part. But you can find this. A lot of it you find in dairy products. So you can even look, next time you go to the grocery store and you buy milk, it may say, enriched with vitamin D or fortified with vitamin D fortified, meaning vitamin D has been added to that product. But also, maybe more notably, vitamin D you can get from the sun, right? So you can get it from ultraviolet rays. It converts the cholesterol in our skin ultimately into vitamin D. Next one is vitamin E, right? Vitamin E is going to kind of help stabilize parts of our cell. And it's also going to act as an antioxidant. We're going to talk about antioxidants in a little bit, but again, you can get this from fish oils, seeds, leafy green vegetables, things like that, right? And then vitamin K is a big one. Vitamin K is necessary for clotting. Right? You need this in order to synthesize certain clotting factors. Those clotting factors are proteins that are made in the liver, and those clotting factor proteins are necessary for coagulating blood during episodes of hemorrhage, bleeding, things like that. Right? And so we can get vitamin K in green leafy vegetables, but we can also make it ourselves. Some of our gut bacteria is also responsible for producing vitamin K. Okay, so for water soluble, these are there's only two types of water soluble. There's vitamin C and then our B vitamins, but there are several different B vitamins, and we won't go over all of them, but just know that there are several. So these dissolve in water. They're not stored in the fat, so they typically don't accumulate to toxic levels. So for example, vitamin C, you need this to make collagen. So easy way to remember this, vitamin C, think the C is standing for collagen, right? But it's also acting as an antioxidant. We'll talk about antioxidants in a little bit. Vitamin C, citrus fruits, green leafy vegetables, broccoli, tomatoes, things like that, right? B vitamins, there's a whole host of B vitamins, and they are designated by a number, so B1, 2, 5, 3, 5, 9, and so on, right? So thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, all of these are B vitamins that are vitamin B12 is another common one. All of these are necessary for various cellular processes in the body. So take, for example, B9, folic acid. This is necessary for proper formation of the nervous system in the embryo, in the fetus. And so if a pregnant mother is deficient in folate or folic acid, then you can end up with something called neural tube defects in the fetus. And so many prenatal vitamins, women who are attempting to become pregnant are often encouraged and advised to ensure they are intaking, they have a sufficient intake of folic acid. So in the event that they do become pregnant, there is a lower risk of neural tube defects. Vitamin B12. We've talked about vitamin B12 in previous lectures when we talked about the gut, but also when we talked about red blood cells, right? So vitamin B12 is necessary for absorbing, there's a protein called intrinsic factor from our stomach that is necessary to absorb vitamin B12. And so if you lack that intrinsic factor from the parietal cells, remember parietal cells are the same cells that produce hydrochloric acid. If you lack that intrinsic factor, then you are typically B12 deficient, and you have something called pernicious anemia. And so the vitamin B12 is necessary for synthesizing, ultimately, our red blood cells. Okay. So in that case, if you lack the intrinsic factor and you can't absorb the vitamin B12, typically you need vitamin B12 injections, right? So administering that directly into the bloodstream. Okay. So again, many of these different vitamins, including our B vitamins that we just talked about, are acting as antioxidants. Many of them are acting as coenzymes as well. So a coenzyme is essentially a molecule that is necessary for an enzyme to function properly, right? So in this kind of schematic, you can see how the enzyme fits with the coenzyme, and then that allows the two substrates to come in and interact appropriately with the enzyme-coenzyme structure. They're also serving as antioxidants. Okay, so antioxidants are molecules that are acting on and eliminating free radicals, which are these lone electron pairs that have the potential to cause serious damage to our cells, potentially contribute to disease as well, aging, cognitive disorders potentially, and so these antioxidants, many of these vitamins are acting as antioxidants to eliminate those and thus prevent or minimize the effects of those dangerous free radicals. Okay. So next thing we can look at are our minerals. Okay, so minerals, you know these as things that we find on the periodic table, right? Our elements, and you can talk about them in terms of their um, uh, percentage in the body. So meaning, what is their relative abundance, or what percentage of the body is made up of each of these different types. And so you can see oxygen is significant, right? So I think most of our body is water. We've got oxygen as a part of water, so along with hydrogen as well. We are carbon-based as well. We are a carbon-based life form. And so we've got carbon, and then even some of these smaller ones like phosphorus, potassium, sodium, relatively small, but they're still absolutely necessary, right? You've also got trace minerals. Okay, so these are minerals that we need proportionally less than these major minerals, right? And so I can't talk about talking about different types of minerals and how they are found in the human body without talking about this right here. So this is Breaking Bad. Okay, so if you have not seen Breaking Bad, do yourself a huge favor and go watch it. Okay, it's probably one of the best shows that's ever been produced, at least in my opinion. It's wonderful, but there's a scene here early on in the show where they find themselves with a dead body, and I won't spoil it for you how that works, but they end up with a dead body and they have to get rid of it, so they dissolve it in hydrofluoric acid, and it essentially falls through the roof of one of the characters' homes, and they're cleaning it up, and Walter White has this flashback to when he was in grad school looking at the composition of the body, and he's talking through all of the different minerals, and he goes through hydrogen and carbon and calcium and iron and all these different ones, right? So do yourself a favor and go watch this. Okay, so we could look at some of these minerals, and they have varied functions, and we'll look at in detail at some more of them, right? And so we may think of these as electrolytes, so sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, calcium, things like that. And in previous lectures, either in this course or in another one, you've talked about the action potential, and you've talked about muscle contraction, and you've talked about how the heart contracts and things like that. All of those are dependent on electrolytes, right? In this course, we've talked about fluid volume, right? So we've talked about blood pressure and blood volume, and that's very much dependent on sodium levels, right? And so water follows sodium, as we know, through osmosis. And so these electrolytes and these minerals have significant functions in the body. Iron, we've talked about when we did blood cells. For bone health, as you can see, we have a major, calcium has a major role to play in that, along with the vitamin D that we talked about previously with calcium absorption, right? And so these minerals are absolutely vital, right? So if we look at some of these, iron, right? Iron is a common mineral that we need. It is most probably famously known for its role in transporting oxygen, right, as a part of hemoglobin, along with myoglobin that we find in our muscles. It's considered a trace mineral, right? But don't think that because something is a trace mineral that we need only a little bit of it, or that we only find a little bit of it in the body, that it's not important. It's still absolutely important, right? So in this case, think carrying oxygen in the blood, right? So iron deficiency, anemia, things like that. Another one is calcium, right? So calcium has a myriad of roles to play, right? So think it has to do with the structure of our bones and the hardness of our bone, right? It has to do with blood clotting, right? So one of our clotting factors is one of them is calcium, right? Calcium is necessary for the release of neurotransmitters at our synaptic terminals, right? These axon terminals, the action potential arrives, calcium rushes in, and we release neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. We need it for muscle contraction as it binds to the troponin protein, right? So calcium is, as with all these others, absolutely vital. Right. And then again, talking about these various required minerals and nutrients and whatnot, you can't talk about those without talking about water, right? And so water is everywhere in the body. We are primarily water, and then just think about around us, right? Most of our Earth is water as well, right? And so in our bodies, in the context of anatomy and physiology, water is sometimes referred to as the universal solvent, right? Meaning that chemical reactions, cellular processes, metabolism, all these different things occur um, in and among water, and oftentimes require water, or they may even produce water, as we'll see with our cellular respiration later on. But again, think of all your fluid: urine, tears, saliva, cerebrospinal fluid, your blood, sweat, all of that. Basically, any fluid you can think of, intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid, the bulk of that is water, right? The bulk of that is water. And we've talked about fluid balance in previous lectures. Okay, so all of these different vitamins and minerals and nutrients and all these different things, how do we ultimately get them to where we can use them, right? And a lot of it has to do with our hepatic portal system, right? So our hepatic portal system, this has to do with moving nutrients from our gut and ultimately taking it to the liver, right? So this term hepatic is meaning liver, right? So in this case, what we're doing is we're essentially absorbing, for the first time in the gut, we're absorbing our various nutrients from the small intestine and from the large intestine, and we're taking those ultimately back to ultimately to the liver through something called a hepatic portal vein, right? So the hepatic portal vein is unique because it's a vein that goes into an organ, right? Or it's bringing blood into an organ, right? So think most veins, if you think back to our circulation discussions, veins are typically taking blood out of an organ and going back to the heart, right? And except for, of course, our vena cava, those are our veins taking blood into an organ, taking it into the heart. But most veins are bringing blood away from tissues, away from an organ. In this case, we have a hepatic portal vein that's taking oxygen poor, nutrient-rich blood from our gut and taking it into the liver, ultimately for nutrient storage, right? So it's going to drop off the nutrients in the liver is going to store it, and then we can pull on those nutrients in the event that we need it in the future, right? So the hepatic portal vein, as you can see on this kind of far right schematic here, made up of the splenic vein and the superior mesenteric vein. So this is the splenic vein here coming from the spleen, and then we have a superior mesenteric vein coming in. Those fuse, they merge, and they form this large portal vein here, right? There's something called a portal triad, and this portal triad is formed from a branch of the hepatic portal vein, the hepatic artery, along with something called the bile duct. Okay, bringing bile out of the liver to the gallbladder and ultimately to the small intestine, right? But you can see the same thing here. So here's a splenic vein coming from the spleen. Here's a superior mesenteric vein. This would be inferior mesenteric vein. Those two fuse, they merge, and they form this portal vein here, right? So remember from our circulation lectures, this term portal. A portal is essentially a network of blood vessels that begins and ends with capillaries, right? So we start with capillaries here at the level of our gut, we merge those and form those into larger veins, and then we end up back at capillaries once we get into the liver, right? But again, big takeaway from this is that hepatic portal vein, this hepatic portal system, taking nutrient-rich blood from the gut and taking it into the liver for storage, okay? So let's stop here, and we will pick up with our next part, and we'll begin talking about nutritional recommendations. We'll talk about calorie balance, and we'll talk about BMI and weight gain and weight loss, and then we'll ultimately get into discussions of cellular respiration.